Okay, so structure, number one. This is, and I didn't put them in any order, so it's not like structure is, more important than age of dog. It's there. There's no sort of order to this. But number one with structure is I don't want you to be blind to your dog's weaknesses. Okay, not all dogs have the classic agility body that perhaps we're looking for. I mean, there's so many variety of breeds out there now and structures. There's sport mixes. There is such variety, which means they come with different structures. And there's pros and there's cons to every single dog. I've never looked at a dog, any dog going, wow, you are absolutely like 1000% perfect. I can generally find something with the dogs, and that's okay because it's no different than evaluating humans. We all have little structural things that are unique to us. And it's not a bad thing. It just means we have to be aware of them. So I really need you to be objective about your dog. That is number one. Another big thing here is setting realistic turning expectations for your dog. So my Aussie Quinn, God love her, she's 9. And I'm not gonna lie, she turns like a cruise ship, okay? And she's rectangular built, she has no tail, she has no dew claws. The poor kid didn't get the best that way. And this was years ago, and the breeder at the time wasn't she wasn't leaving dew claws on. She wasn't leaving tails on. She actually doesn't believe in any of those things. That's a whole other story. But we have to be realistic. My expectations of how tightly Quinn can turn versus Keeper is very, very different. So I think that's something to think about too, because sometimes I have people coming to me going, hey, my dogs aren't turning tight. And I look at their videos and I go, they're actually turning as they should for the type of dog and the type of structure that they are. So that's one thing. If we're setting unrealistic expectations of our dogs, that's going to be a bit of an issue as well. Weight plays a huge role. I mean, overweight dogs should not be playing in agility, but I can't tell you how many times and how many trials I go to where I see overweight dogs competing, and it literally just breaks my heart because dogs at the end of the day will always do what we want. They will follow along with us. They want to, they want to be with us. They love getting reinforced. They love the game. They're going to play it whether they're 10 pounds overweight or not. And it's up to us to make sure that our dog is a good weight so that they can meet the physical demands of this. Because as you're going to learn, there's a lot to tight turn that is very physically demanding on our dogs. And then if our dogs are constantly turning wide, they are going to be compensating other ways that could eventually lead to a potential injury or compensation issues. And extra weight is just not good on joints and tendons and ligaments and muscles. It's just not good for our dogs who we're expecting to be athletes. And this doesn't matter if you're a weekend competitor or like me, on the international level. It doesn't matter. The physical requirements of the sport are the same from starters to Team Canada, okay? Shoulder angulation is another big one. And we could dive into, angulation of the hind end and the front end and do a whole entire different webinar on this as well. But our angulation of our shoulder does affect things as well. So if a dog has a really upright shoulder, okay, then what happens is, number one, is their head tends to be quite high. Well, this becomes a problem because as a dog comes over a bar to turn tight, we need to round their back and they need to sort of look down and then turn. So if our head is really high up, that becomes a bit more of a problem because they can't look down as well, okay? How they lift up, if they have a really straight front, it's going to be harder to pop those front paws up. It's not as easy to do. When they have a straight shoulder, they're not as flexible. So those sort of border collies that get really low to the ground, if you've got a really straight front, you don't have the flexibility to do that. That's important for when you're landing right about to do your tight turn. Shock absorption is another thing. If we have a really straight front, we have less shock absorbers. There's a tongue twister for Sunday, but we have less shock absorbers, which means that there's going to be more compensation on the dog. It's going to be harder on them physically to do the tight turns. Same with hind end angulation. So if we're over angulated, so think of like a Doberman whose hocks are quite far back from sort of their lower end of the pelvis. Or think of like the German Shepherds. Not that we've seen many German Shepherds compete, and I'm sure there's a reason why for that. But if they're overangulated, there's going to be less stability in the hind end, which means it's a lot harder to turn. The dogs that are overangulated in the hind end tend to have sloppy sits. Well, it's important to be able to achieve a nice square sit with our jumping, right? If we're always jumping like this, that puts a lot more stress on knees, puts more stress on hips, start worrying about cruciates, right? If we're under angulated, okay, so we're sort of very much underneath us. We see this, think of like an older dog, right, who tends to be underneath themselves a little bit in their hind end, right? It kind of scoots in because they don't have the muscle tone anymore to really stand up nice and square. This starts happening as dogs get older because they tend to lose some muscle from the hind end. So just sort of picture that. But if they're underangulated as just their structure, they tend to have less power. They tend to use their front end more. If they use their front end more, that's not great either. So for the reasons I just mentioned before. So hind end angulation and front end angulation play a really big role in this. And regardless of what your dog has, there's always exercises that we can do to augment some of this stuff. So it's not like, oh gosh, my dog's really overangulated, this is not good. It just means that, you know your dog is less stable, so we might need some more balance exercises to help support some of this. Tails are super important, and I so wish Quinn had a tail, and I wish I could just add a tail to her, but I can't. But it's used for counterbalance for turning, right? So my breeder who said to me, oh, Carolyn, tails don't do anything. I go, just watch a dog's tail. I think it is just so cool to watch not only how dogs interact with other dogs using their tails as communication, but even from just the physical standpoint of what it does, or when they're really trying to find balance, right? And tails also are really good for assisting with jumping. So it's actually going to lower when the dog elevates, and it raises up to land. So it's aerodynamic. So when you don't have it like poor Quinn, there are going to be more compensation issues. That's just par for the course, and you just have to plan for that. It's the same with the dew claws. So the hind end dew claws are useless. They're there for several breeds have that in their standard, that the hind end dew claws have to be there. They're literally attached with flabs of skin, so they don't actually have any functional use for the dogs. The front dew claws actually do. They have 5 tendons that attach to them. They are incredibly functional. Now, in walking and trotting, they're useless. They do nothing. They're just there. But as the dog starts to canter and starts to gallop, that's where the dew claw sinks into the ground to help with turning. So this is why it's so important, because it prevents torque. So as the dog is turning, the dew claw digs in and prevents excessive shock sort of on the wrist, on the elbow, on the shoulder, and assists with that dog's turning. So when they don't have that, then what happens is they can misstep more, they can slip. This is something that I have seen with Shades. So Shades doesn't have dew claws. He's from pure conformation lines where they just always remove the dew claws. 50 and Shades, they're both half brothers. They have the same dad, but they have different moms. But both of them don't have dew claws. Now, 50 is retired from agility at this point. That just really wasn't his jam. But Shades, as you know, is I'm hoping to get him back internationally. But I think one major issue for him is the fact that he doesn't have the dew claws. And I see this on turns sometimes where he is going full speed and he is not a slow Sheltie, and he's going to turn, and sometimes he just slips. And it's not because there's something wrong with his front end. I mean, trust me, I check this dog all the time. I think if he had a dew claw, that would be really helpful, because now I see Siren, his daughter, I see Keeper, both who have dew claws, and I see how they turn, and it's very, very different. So again, we can't change it. I can't add on, a dew claw. However, I do make sure that front end is really strong, and do, my best to make sure that his body is supported, knowing that there's going to be more forces that act through those front paws. Joanne says, in Quebec, we have now interdicted by law to retire dew claws, except if there's an accident and it's needed. Yeah, and I think that's brilliant, because I think people also think that it's the digit that gets injured the most, and that's actually not the case. There is a study that showed the digit that gets injured the most is the outside front digit, right? It's not the actual dew claw. And I think sometimes some of the issues that come from it in terms of injury is a lot of people don't maybe trim them as often, and they should, because they're not getting worn down. They're not like the other nails that when you're out walking on the sidewalk, they can wear down. They don't really wear down that much as the front ones. So if they go longer and longer, then that's when they can, potentially sort of get hooked or something like that. And I do find that there has been some dogs who have like a loosey-goosey dew claw, right? For whatever reason, it's just loosey-goosey. The skin is a little bit loose. That's just, that's their norm. But sometimes that can catch a little bit more as well. Can lack of dew cause increase shoulder issues? Kim, yeah. Like, I worry sometimes about Shades a little bit with his front wrists and his elbows and his shoulders, because I think it certainly can play an issue, because there's more forces now that are going to act on that limb, right? Because you don't have that dew claw to help prevent that torque, right? Which also helps to improve the turning. So absolutely, I think dew claws can be a big issue in conjunction generally with other stuff, but I think it can be. The other thing too is that going back to setting those realistic expectations, okay? So poor Quinn is rectangular built and she has no dew claws and no tail. So my expectations for her when she is turning on a course is that I don't ask for a really tight turn now with Quinn anywhere, because if I ask for too tight of a turn, what happens is the bar comes down every single time. So I will allow her to drift. I know I have to then manage the off courses because when she sees something, she's like, oh, did you want that one? So you have to manage that a little bit more, but I found a good way of managing it now. So from a handling standpoint, you might have to change some of your things as well and going, okay, you know what? My dog realistically is just not going to turn tight. I now have to change some things to support that. Carrie says there are some exceptional Aussies without tails that compete and win nationally. Yeah, absolutely, Carrie. Absolutely. I'm just saying if I had to do this all over again, I would want a tail and I would want Duclos, right? And again, there are some that do fantastically. I mean, there are some dogs who are competing at Worlds who don't have really the great structure, like the best structure at all that you go, oh my gosh, how is this dog doing this? But they have heart and they have determination. And there's lots of reasons how dogs get around courses, right? So I'm not saying it's gonna mean that your dog can't play in the sport and can even do well in the sport. For me, for Quinn, it's been an issue, right? I think again, every dog's a little bit different, but that's not to say that just because you don't have them, you can't be a good agility dog. I think too, if Quinn had different foundations than, you know, where she had been with me now as a puppy, it'd be a very different story as well, right? Okay, the other structure thing is, I'm not going to go too long into this, but dogs are sort of classed into three sort of body types, okay? There's an ectomorphic, an endomorphic, and a mesomorphic. And the mesomorphic is like your square-built dogs, like your labs, your Aussies, Shelties. They have more of that sort of classic agility body, okay? Your endomorphic, these are your chondrodystrophic dwarfs. So basically your longer dogs, your basset hounds, your Norwich terriers, your corgis, they are short-strided, they are long back, and they do struggle with jumping. They're great with tunnels though, which is awesome. The ones that have the biggest issue with jumping, or not with jumping, sorry, with tight turns, is our long-legged dogs, okay? So our sighthounds, our Dobermans, our GSPs, these guys do not have issues with jumping whatsoever. They never knock bars. They literally sail over the bars, but they have problems with those tight turns because they have a higher center of gravity based on how they're built. Kim says the Swedish Valhund. Yes, I should change that. I should make sure the Swedish Valhund's on here. I would not want to upset Kim. I'll make sure to change that for my next time. But dogs with those long legs can have difficulty turning. So again, this is where you've got to manage your expectations in terms of the build that you have for your dog. Okay, fitness level. I mean, I think I could do a whole webinar on this one as well. I could do a whole webinar thing on each of the individual components of all of this. But here are some physical requirements that they need for the tight turn, right? Ability to maintain a square sitting position. So here, keeper on the side is in a nice square sitting position. Hind paws are tracking forward, feet are forward, back is on that nice 45-degree angle. All the paws are nice and even. They need to be able to do this. So Kim Collins gave me this photo she sent to me the other day. Like, look at her dog here, almost in that full sitting position, like being able to complete a tuck sit. So if your dog can't do this on equipment, then I start to worry that this is going to change how they do their jumps. Okay. They need to be able to shift weight to their hind end. If they can't, and they're very focused on the front end, then they're not going to be able to push and extend it nearly as well, right? Because they're going to be pulling from the front. Well, we need them to be underneath themselves because then they're going to be jumping more forward versus up, which is an issue for tight turns. Hind end strength and power, okay, so we need symmetry, but there's inside leg considerations. When we're turning really tight to the right, there is more pressure on that inside leg, right? So from a fitness standpoint, you got to make sure you are not just doing exercises like Sphinx down and rock back sit and things that always use two legs. You need to make sure you're strengthening individual legs as well. Because in agility, they don't always put 50% of their weight on their left and 50% of the weight on the right hind legs, right? When they're turning, that inside leg is always taking more work. They need a lot of hind end body awareness, right? Especially as they're going to land and they have to stabilize and get balance and then power out. We need to know where our hind end is. Okay, other things is endurance. So when tight turns start to go south, I find dogs can be tired, right? So towards the end of the weekend, sometimes you see this in competitions. Dogs are much wider at the end of a competition sometimes than they were on the first day, right? Especially look at something like the US Open, right? How big those runs were. And, you know, it's over 4 or 5 days, right? These dogs by the end are quite tired. So what's their fitness level like from a cardio standpoint, right? Pelvic stability. This is a big one. How stable is your dog's pelvis? If you're going to the chiropractor and every month they are saying, hey, your dog's pelvis is out, which how many people put up your hand? How many people have had that issue where they go to the chiro and the pelvises are constantly out, right? They're malaligned. They need adjustments. Just comment yes if you have a dog who frequently gets their pelvis adjusted, right? Kim, yes. Lisa says yes. Who else? Be honest. This is a time for honesty. Right. So lots of yeses, right? If your dog's pelvis is constantly going out of alignment, I'm going to argue that there's a muscle imbalance. We need to give your dog exercises to strengthen their pelvis, which is also going to help their tight turns. We need a nice, strong pelvis, and it has to be able to be flexible as well. Think of like if you're kicking a ball. Okay. If you just kick a ball forward, you don't turn your hips at all, right? You keep your pelvis straight and you just kick a ball. It's kind of awkward, right? But if you like go up to the ball and sort of twist and rotate your pelvis a little bit and then kick, it's like, it's much smoother, right? It's the same thing with dogs. They need to be able to have that flexibility in the pelvis, but they also have to have the stability strength. And so when agility dogs are constantly getting their pelvises out, this can drastically affect the wide turns as well. Core strength, we need core strength for a lot of things in agility, but especially for tight turns as well, which is also going to help their jumping efforts too. General strengthening, right? To hold a bend on a turn. You saw that video of Siren, right? When she was so young. And I wanted to put that in there because I want to show you at 9 months, they do not have the proper strength to do a 5-jump bend grid from speed, right? So we have to think about this because there's other examples and other exercises. Explosive power out of the turn. They need to be able to power out of that turn because if not, they're going to take more strides. It's going to slow everything down. And it just makes you have to be flat-footed and stand still for a second while the dog then catches up to you. So flexibility is a huge one and definitely influences tight turns because if we don't have flexibility in our spine, in our hips, in our neck, it's going to reduce the dog's ability to be able to turn tightly. So when I think of, why would a dog maybe have poor flexibility? Can be the structure of breed. That's certainly an issue. Lack of warming up, like I talked about before, right? If you're just throwing your dog out there cold and asking them to turn tightly, it's not going to happen well. If they have tight muscles, right? If they're tight in their back, that can be an issue. So if the dog is turning to the right and they're tight in their back, they're lengthening the left side of their back as they're turning to the right, which means that could be a bit tighter. There could be a pain or injury. It could be a current or it could be a past or it could be a chronic condition that they have. So maybe your dog is just not the most flexible dog. Maybe they have, some arthritis. Doesn't mean they can't play. It just means, again, you're going to have to be mindful of their tight turns and what you're actually realistically going to get. Reduced overall activity. So let's say your dog's not very active. I see this in the weekend warrior syndromes. So these are the people that just compete on the weekends and they literally do nothing Monday to Friday. So these dogs sit around, they, watch the world go by from the couch all week. And then on the weekend, it's like, yeah, let's go do agility. And they're entered in like 10 runs over the weekend. And these dogs are not very flexible dogs. And so that can definitely contribute to why maybe they are not turning tight. Now, it is normal for dogs to have a side preference, okay? This is very typical, but we can work through this, okay? We have a side preference as well. If I, kick a soccer ball towards you, you're going to kick it back to me with your preferred leg. It's very similar to the dogs. They are going to have a side that's better than the other, but they should still be able to do it when asked.